And we're back. This is The Absolute Truth with Emerald Robinson. No, I am not Emerald. She will be back tomorrow. Trump seems to be feeling his oats now that he's gotten a deal on the Gaza side of things. While on his trip to the Mideast yesterday, Trump even talked about the ongoing trade war with China. We spoke yesterday with my buddy Dan Collins about that issue. But Trump also spoke about the Ukraine war, and he reiterated his desire to get a deal. Is the deal going to happen, or is Trump going to give in to the masturbatory fantasies of the neocons in his midst and trigger a wider war with Russia over Ukraine, which I remind everybody is not even a NATO member? It could go either way at this point. In a forthcoming piece by yours truly, I outline how Europe today isn't feeling like 1939, as the neocons would have you think. It's feeling a lot like 1914, with the United States playing the role of Great Britain, and that ain't good. I'd rather it be like 1989, maybe. Joining us now is a great panel, two titans of foreign policy, my buddy Andrew Day, the senior editor at the American Conservative, and the great Scott Horton, author most recently of Provoked: How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. It is such an honor to have both of you on the same panel with me. We will start with a more general question. We know that there's a tug of war going on behind the scenes in the administration. Emerald's reporting on that over the Ukraine war. Who's winning the tug of war for control over the Ukraine policy? It seems since May the neocons are, but maybe I'm wrong. Is there a shift possibly at hand? Why don't you start out for us, Scott, please?
Oh, I wish I knew the answer to that. If you guys have a good reading list for who's got the insight of what's really going on in the White House and the different faction fights there, I've missed those. I do read TAC every morning, that's for sure. I don't know, but I guess I will say that, Trump, I believe, was absolutely sincere in wanting to end this war. When he said, I can end it in a day, he didn't really know how he was going to do that. And I think he didn't necessarily understand what were the dynamics on the ground. And what he's up against is the fact that the Russians are winning slowly. And they still have about a quarter of Donetsk to take before they can say that they've taken all of the Donbass. The Kremlin has, I think, surprisingly, a couple of different times said that they may even be willing to climb down on their control over Zaporozhye and Kherson and maybe draw the lines where they are there. They have their so-called land bridge across the Azov coast to Crimea, and enough to guarantee fresh water resources from the Dnieper River to Crimea. And they've signaled that they might be willing to leave that, good enough there. But so that means that the Russians don't want to stop fighting now. And the Ukrainians, they still stand on 1/4 of Donetsk Oblast, and they don't want to turn around and walk away if they don't have to. And then, of course, there's other fighting up and down the line there, but that's the major impasse here. And I read actually Mr. Day's article on TAC with great interest about how he thinks that Trump actually can bring Putin to the table here. So I'll be quiet and let him say about that.
Oh, well, and you read the room perfectly, because I was going to pivot over to that. Thank you for that, Scott. Yeah, so Andrew, if I understand correctly, Andrew, you just got back from Ukraine, and the essay is entitled "Yes, Trump Can End the Russia-Ukraine War," so why don't you tell us, based on your essay, what the prospects are for a deal? Because it really does sound, I believe Trump is sincere when he says he really wants a deal, but maybe that's just me.
Yeah, well, first, thanks for having me on. My feelings might be a bit more not quite as optimistic as that title would suggest, but I do think that Trump still has a chance to end this war. I want to say that the situation in Ukraine is grim. I lived last week through what felt like a dramatic failure of Ukraine's air defense systems. They're running out of interceptor missiles. The interception rate is declining to like under 10% at this point when it comes to ballistic missiles. I actually haven't had time to read all the reports on what happened last Thursday night, but based on my conversations with people on the ground, it sounds like just about every ballistic missile got through. And part of the reason for that decreasing interception rate is that they have to be more sparing with their interceptors because they're running out of them. So instead of firing 3 at a ballistic missile, maybe you fire 1, or maybe you don't fire 1 at all, depending on where it's headed and whether you prioritize that target. So that's not a good situation. And then also on the front, Scott just mentioned that, or kind of alluded to the fact that Russia is advancing slowly. I think that they're advancing slowly kind of by design. I don't think they're necessarily trying to take territory at the earliest possibility. I think they're trying to basically attrit Ukrainian forces, and they're doing a good job. Ukrainian media is actually more candid, much more candid on this than the Western media is. They're having acute manpower issues among infantry units in the Ukrainian military. And, I talked to a lot of men on the street and kind of, somewhat awkwardly got myself to a position where I could ask non-aggressively, like, why aren't you fighting? And multiple men said to me, they alluded to vague kind of health issues. And, I don't begrudge them that. I'm not criticizing them. I was staying at a nice hotel and in a bomb shelter, and this hotel was not a target of the Russian attack. And I was scared. So I can imagine they're scared to go to the front. So it's a grim situation. But I think that Trump has done a few things very well, and now he needs to just have some strategic patience. To answer your question that you posed to Scott, I think the Kellogg faction, the Keith Kellogg faction, is ascendant in the White House, and that's not a good thing, because this is basically the faction that thinks that we just have to bleed Russia dry and just impose all these costs on them to bring him to the table. I don't think that's going to work. I think Russia has escalation dominance. I think what Trump has done well, and what he should kind of keep in his back pocket, is he put on the table the possibility of a broader U.S.-Russia rapprochement. And when I talk to national security elites in Russia, I get the sense that they actually really do want that. They just need to be sure that it's credible and that it's not going to go away as soon as Trump's not in the White House. And so I think as long as Trump has that on the table, Putin has a big incentive to end this war. I also think it wouldn't necessarily be good for Russia if it just overran Ukraine, because then it would have a big problem on its hands. It would have this incredible animosity with the West and especially with Europe. And it's going to be better for all parties involved, I think, if this ends in a settlement, in a peace deal. And I think Trump can still get it done, but it's going to be very difficult. And, part of what makes it difficult is in order to keep alive the possibility of a negotiated settlement, we have to kind of keep Ukraine in the fight. And that's where things get a little dicey, because I don't think it has a lot of fight left in it.
I couldn't agree more. And the number, actually, I did the reporting at the National Interest a few weeks ago. It's now 6%. The interception, I think it went from 43 or 34% in August to now 6% interception rate, which is not good. If they had gotten a deal, on day one, they might have not been in this position. But so, Scott, we hear this now coming from the ground in Ukraine. Why hasn't Trump just stopped the weapons flows to Ukraine? I feel like that would have been the thing that would have forced Zelensky to the table. Is it just this warmongering party, or is there some misunderstanding on his part about what's going on, do you think?
Well, I mean, politics has a lot to do with it, because, of course, Ukraine has been invaded and are defending. So leaving them high and dry is a far different prospect than, for example, picking up the phone and calling off Netanyahu, who is, by far the overwhelming power versus his enemies in the Gaza Strip, right? So, I could never come out in favor of weapons transfers by this government to anyone in any part of any war. I'm just too Ron Paulian for that. But I do take Mr. Day's point that, keeping Ukraine in the fight long enough to negotiate a deal would make sense, all other things being equal. Problem is that, I think what it comes down to really is, and I don't really know, he may know a lot more about, what they're talking about in Moscow than I do. I really don't know. But it would seem to me, just kind of projecting, that they would be very skeptical of any real normalization. That it's, as far as sticks, Joe Biden already tried that, and Trump and Europe have already tried that, pouring in as many weapons as they can, as the Ukrainian military said for a couple of years now. They don't even have the manpower, as Andrew just said, they don't even have the manpower to field the weapons that they're asking for, or that the Americans want to give them. So there's that. And then as far as carrots, promising normalization to the Russians, I don't know if anyone could expect them to really believe it. I mean, proverbially, God forgive me for saying, but we could have President Chelsea Clinton next. And then who thinks that Donald Trump, all of Washington, D.C. says that, even though he's been elected 3 times, that Donald Trump is a total aberration. The American people don't want him. The American establishment doesn't want him, and they don't stand by any of his policies. They'll reverse them at their first opportunity. Yeah. And so if you're the foreign policy establishment in Moscow, I guess what I'm saying is I think Trump would have to, when we say normalization, we're talking about dropping all sanctions, as Mr. Day says in his new piece, really reinvigorating the NATO-Russia Council, finding a way to really make them a part of this. How about getting back in the INF treaty, signing an extension of New START for the next 20 years, and maybe getting on some more nuclear treaties after that, and like finding a way to really do like Reagan and Gorbachev, where we just shake hands like hell here and nobody can undo it after that, you know?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and this got me on a lot of blacklists in DC. But I agree with your thesis on NATO expansion being the trigger, the provocation for the war. I still deal a lot with the Poles. I do a lot of consulting work with the defense establishment, and every time I turn around, both sides in Poland are saying the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. To me, it looks like the Russians are pretty content to stay in eastern Ukraine and Crimea. I don't really see them. So I'd love to get your both opinion. Is there any merit to the fears on the part, notably of those in Eastern Europe, that the Russians are going to take Ukraine and then, like Hitler, keep going and the Blitzkrieg will continue? Either one can jump in first.
Well,
no, but I'll let Andrew go. It's his turn.
Yeah, I mean, I think that some level of fear is justified. I agree totally with Scott Horton's thesis and Provoked. I totally think that the U.S. completely mismanaged its relations with Russia, and this expansion of NATO was highly provocative, and we made this invasion of Ukraine much more likely, and I would be willing to agree we provoked this invasion. But what does that mean now? Basically, what it means now is Russia is provoked. They are in a bit of a revanchist mood, but when we're kind of assessing how concerned Europeans should be that they're just going to kind of run through Europe, we can't just look at their intentions and what we speculate their intentions to be. We have to look at their capabilities. And they're having trouble even capturing all of Donetsk, as Scott mentioned. They still haven't captured about 25%. I think it's a similar number in Zaporizhia. So I don't think that we should be worried that they're going to Hitler-like kind of march through Europe. Yeah. We might see some hybrid warfare. I do think that these drone incursions in Poland and Romania, we shouldn't freak out about them, but I think that there was some sort of effort there to kind of troll the Europeans or get them scared or like elicit a kind of buffoonish reaction. I don't know what the logic was entirely, but clearly, Russia has a lot of antipathy towards the Europeans right now. The Europeans are very frightened. It's one reason that I really think that we should try to get a deal to end this war, because in getting a deal to end the Ukraine war, we can get some sort of settlement, some sort of security architecture between Europe and Russia, at the very least, just some sort of explicit repudiation of the idea of Ukraine joining NATO, which will assuage Russia's concerns. But no, they shouldn't be worried that Putin is the next Hitler. Actually, in the national security context of Russia, he's a relative moderate. There are some hardliners, to his right, I guess we could say. I don't see him as a Hitler 2.0.
And in fact, your piece, you seemed very hopeful and go ahead, Scott. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I would just say real quick, because you hear this stuff all the time, and Hillary Clinton just pretended to cite this in a dispute at the Council on Foreign Relations the other day, that Hitler said that Putin said, yes, I'm Hitler, and I want to recreate the the Soviet Union or the Tsarist Empire and all this. And the thing is, those quotes are just completely out of context. And Absolutely. I address this in my book. The one where he says that the fall of the Soviet Union was a catastrophe. Yep. He's not announcing a new foreign policy about making up for that by recreating the thing. It was what it was in context was it was a litany of terrible things that had happened to Russia recently until good old me came and got sworn in and made everything right again. Right? It was a disaster and renewal trope. And one of the things that happened was, we lost our empire, we went bankrupt, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then luckily I came and made everything right again. That was the entire context of that. He was not in any sense expressing his intent or ambition to recreate the empire. I would say, if I'm playing, absolutely give, devil's advocate position, there's this one city I never pronounce it right, I'm sorry, I think it's Nesta or something like that, in eastern Estonia. That's a very Russian city that I could see, like, on his wildest day, Putin maybe going there. But, like, retaking the entire Baltics, I don't think so. And really, even the controversy there was, hey, you better protect minority rights there and don't give me a problem. What do we see in Ukraine? We saw a massive 7-year civil war against the Russian minority in the far east and south of the country there. That ended up, as one of the major factors provoking the war. So is there really any incentive for the Russians to retake this city in eastern Estonia to protect those people? I mean, they could claim that, but they would have no real excuse to do that. And great reason for Estonia to protect those people's freedom so that there's nothing to fight about. But otherwise, no. And by the way, Robert Kagan himself, Mr. Neocon, Bill Kristol's writing partner, Mr. Benevolent Global Hegemony, has said, actually, you know what? Turns out, now that I think about it, Ukraine doesn't matter to America at all. And we don't really care who rules that country. It makes no difference to our national security whatsoever. And his wife, Victoria Nuland, the ruiner of all things good and major instigator in all of these problems, she said, it turns out that Russia's really a paper tiger. They can barely take eastern Ukraine. There's no way they're marching on Warsaw, Berlin. She said that in her exit interview. So there you go. From the Kagans' mouths themselves. Nothing to worry about, folks.
It's true. It's true. And, and speaking of neocons, a Pentagon source of mine, a War Department source, they're apparently talking right now about handing over some of these retired Ticonderoga class ships to Ukraine so they can use them as Tomahawk cruise missile launchers. Now, Andrew, you just reported the interception rate and basically the depletion of Ukraine. Do you think that these blessed Tomahawks will have any real significant change on the ground in the warfare with Russia? Or is this just another canard like the tanks, like the F-16s were?
I wouldn't want to dismiss it as a canard. First, I've been talking to Jennifer Kavanaugh, Defense Priorities, and she's been very skeptical of the whole Tomahawks issue. She thinks it's basically a hoax, and she thinks Putin is kind of laughing it off. I haven't heard this latest development. My sense had been that this Tomahawk strategy, the ploy was to get Putin, kind of keep him on his toes and make him think, well, if I don't wrap up this war in 12 to 18 months or so, then maybe Ukraine will somehow acquire the ability to launch them. And it sounds like the Pentagon maybe is making some plans in that direction. I don't think it'll change things on the ground. Russia has the ability to intercept these things. They have their own missiles that are better than Tomahawks, right? So it's not like it's going to give Ukraine a qualitative superiority or something over Russia. What it can do is dramatically increase tensions between Russia and the U.S. Russia changed its nuclear doctrine. They lowered their threshold for nuclear use, specifically in light of this possibility of the U.S. allowing Ukraine to use its weapons to strike Russia, right? Long-range missiles striking deep into Russian territory. And so this is a very dangerous prospect. They had a good reason for doing that, because Ukraine can't actually launch these missiles, even if they have the launchers, without our satellite data and, other sources of intel. We're basically doing everything except for hitting the button launch, right? And Russia knows that, and that's why they would consider that a kind of joint attack by NATO and Ukraine, and one that could conceivably, if the Russian Federation was threatened, or if Putin deemed it to be threatened, it could trigger a massive war, and perhaps to the nuclear level. So, even though I do have my reasoning for wanting to keep Ukraine in the fight, and I agree totally with Scott, what he said earlier, that this is conceptually a very different situation than Israel, where if we just had cut Israel off of military aid, they wouldn't have been able to do what they've been doing in constructing greater Israel and attacking Iran, etc. It's very different with Ukraine, because if we cut them off, it would just mean Russia would overrun them more swiftly. Right. And as I said, I think that's actually fraught with geopolitical peril and political peril for Trump. It would be kind of like an Afghanistan withdrawal type situation, potentially, which is bad for his poll numbers. But even though I see things that way, I'm very wary and opposed of facilitating these long-range strikes into Russia, because I don't see how that's good for American interests.
I couldn't agree more. And this is the last question for the segment. I wish I could keep you on for the whole hour, guys. But for Scott, what is the prospects in your mind? I mean, you are an expert on this issue. What are the prospects in your mind for a real peace in the Ukraine war?
Well, look, I mean, barring the staff in the White House reading the American Conservative and really taking this on board and trying, I mean that seriously. There's not too many people out there with their act together like Mr. Day here on these topics. If they really take that to heart and push hard, there's a possibility. But look, I mean, I think all other things being equal, Russia wins this war in like a year or something. I don't know how long. Everyone always says, as Andrew said, it's a war of attrition. Both sides say that. They're just trying to grind up each other's armies. They're not taking land as fast as they can. At some point, the idea is the other side's army just breaks. And I don't know when that's going to be, where the Russians will eventually just have the run of the place. But I guess I'm pessimistic about a peace deal unless Donald Trump, decides he's really willing to try hard and really willing to, make major concessions on his own and even put forward a positive program for America's relationship with Russia from here on and all of that. And it's like a guy can dream, but I don't really see it.
Well, guys, this has been super informative, very interesting. I'm pretty much on everything you said. I agree with. I too am pessimistic, unfortunately, about the deal, only because, as Dave Smith loves to say, whether you vote Republican or Democrat, you're walking away with John McCain as president. So, I hope that Donald Trump can pull a rabbit out of his hat, but it's not looking good right now there. Thank you guys so much. He is Scott Horton, author most recently of Provoked. Go get it wherever books are sold. And my buddy, Andrew Day, senior editor at the American Conservative. He just got back from Ukraine. Give his writings a follow. They're very, very interesting and informed. Thank you both for coming on, and we will obviously have you back very soon, hopefully.